Every wealthy widow in the valley wanted him. He turned them all away, until a blizzard sent a stranger to his door, and she walked in leading the one thing he thought he'd lost forever. The town said she was dangerous. He said she was the only real thing he'd seen in years. What happened next tore the frontier apart and rebuilt it from the ground up. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The blizzard came without warning, the way the worst things always do. 1 hour the sky was pale and flat, the color of old bone, and the next it cracked open and poured white. Wind screamed down from the high ridges and hit the valley floor with a sound like a freight wagon losing a wheel. A sharp, violent groan followed by nothing but noise. The kind of storm that didn't ask permission, the kind that didn't care what you had planned. Silas Boone stood at the open barn door with his lantern held out and watched his stallion disappear into it. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He just stood there with the snow slapping against his face and the lantern flame guttering sideways, and he watched the last clean shape of Reckoner's black hindquarters vanish into the white like something being swallowed. "Damn," he said finally, to no one. He went back inside, put the lantern on the hook, and sat down on an overturned feed bucket. The other horses shifted and stomped in their stalls. Outside, the wind made a sound like something screaming underwater. He sat there a long time. Silas Boone was 41 years old, and he had owned the Boone Ranch for going on 16 of those years. He'd built it from a half-collapsed claim shack and 42 cattle into one of the most productive spreads in the Carver Valley, 1,200 acres of working grassland, a proper house, 2 functioning barns, a smokehouse, and a bunkhouse that currently slept 4 hired hands. People in Ridgeholme, the town 6 miles east, had opinions about him the way towns always develop opinions about a man who keeps to himself and doesn't fail. The opinions had sharpened considerably over the past 3 years. That was when the widows started coming. It wasn't entirely their fault. Silas was a reasonable-looking man, not handsome in any dramatic way, but solid, with a jaw that didn't apologize for itself, and hands that told you he actually worked the land he owned. He had his hair still, mostly dark with gray threading through at the temples, and the ranch was unquestionably real. You could ride up to it, touch the fence posts, watch the cattle move across the winter pasture. In a valley where hard luck had swallowed 3 other spreads in the last decade, the Boone Ranch was a fact. So the women came. Margaret Holt arrived first, 14 months after her husband Franklin died of a chest ailment that turned to pneumonia before the doctor could do much about it. She owned a good parcel of farmland adjoining Silas's eastern fence and had 2 grown sons who were less useful than she deserved. She brought a pie to the Boone Ranch on a Thursday afternoon and left an hour later carrying the dish and nothing else. Silas had been polite. He thanked her for the pie, told her it was genuinely good, and said he hoped she had a safe ride back. Then came Ruth Connolly, whose husband had left her a mercantile in town and a small cattle herd that she couldn't quite manage. Then Dolores Pruitt, who was frankly the wealthiest woman in Ridgeholme and had made no secret of the fact that she didn't understand what was wrong with Silas Boone. She'd said that to his face sitting in his parlor with the particular directness of a woman who had never been turned down for anything in her life. "There's nothing wrong with me," Silas had told her. "Then why won't you—" "Because I don't want to," he'd said. And that was the end of it. What the town didn't understand, what it had turned into a story about pride or damage or some mysterious broken quality in the man, was actually much simpler. Silas had been married once, for 9 years, to a woman named Clara. She died of a fever 7 years ago, in August, while the grass was still green and the air smelled like summer and everything seemed like it should be fine. He didn't talk about her, not because it destroyed him to— he'd gotten past that kind of grief eventually, the way you do, but because it was his, and he didn't feel like sharing it with people who hadn't known her. The widows weren't bad women. That was what he tried to explain to his hired hand, a long-faced man named Hector Delray, on a Saturday morning when Hector had expressed an opinion about the situation that nobody asked for. "They're fine," Silas said. "That's the problem. They're fine women with fine things, and that's all they are." Hector thought about this. "That ain't much of a reason to stay alone." "I'm not alone," Silas said. "I've got 4 of you underfoot and 40 horses and more cattle than I know what to do with." Hector made a face that communicated his feelings without requiring words. "Mind the fence line on the north pasture," Silas told him. "I saw a post coming loose yesterday." Reckoner had been with him for 11 years. That wasn't nothing. A man could go through a lot in 11 years, and Silas had, and a horse that was there for all of it accumulated a different kind of worth than money. Reckoner was a black Morgan stallion, 16 hands, with a white star on his forehead that had been nearly invisible when he was a colt and was sharp and clear now. He was not an easy horse. He had strong opinions about weather, about strangers, and about being asked to do things he considered beneath him. He had bitten Hector twice. He had also, on a day 2 years ago when Silas's gelding had thrown a shoe on the upper trail and gone lame, carried Silas 7 miles home through ankle-deep mud without complaint or stumble. Now he was gone into a blizzard that had already built 2 feet of drift against the barn wall. Silas sent the hands out at first light. The storm had thinned enough to see, barely, and 4 men spread out across the north pasture and up into the tree line with lanterns and lead ropes. They were back by mid-morning, red-faced and empty-handed, reporting that the snow had obliterated everything. No tracks. The wind had been vicious enough in the night that it had scoured the top layer and redistributed it and left the landscape looking like it had always looked exactly this way. "Could have gone up into the meridian timber," said a hand named Cole, warming his hands at the kitchen stove. "Storm like that, a spooked horse goes uphill. They always go uphill." "Meridian's 5 miles," said another hand, Dobbs. "In that weather." "I know how far it is," Silas said. Nobody said what they were all thinking, which was that a horse alone in that terrain in that storm, even a strong horse, even Reckoner, had a limited range of outcomes, and most of them were bad. Silas stood at the kitchen window and looked at the white valley and said nothing. She came at dusk, when the light had gone flat and purple, and the temperature had dropped again hard enough that even the cold felt cold. Silas heard the dogs first, not the alarm bark, the uncertain one, the bark they used when something arrived that didn't fit any category they had for things. He went to the window and saw a shape coming down the access road, moving through the snow with a slow and steady gait. He couldn't make out what it was in the low light. He pulled on his coat and went to the porch. The shape resolved. It was a woman, walking. A woman in a heavy canvas coat that was dark with moisture, her hat pulled low against the remaining wind, leading a horse by the reins. The horse was staggering. Even from the porch, in the failing light, Silas could see the animal's exhaustion in the way its head hung and its knees buckled slightly with each step. He walked down off the porch and across the yard, and as he got close enough to see clearly, his chest did something complicated. It was Reckoner. The stallion's coat was matted with ice and snow that had partially melted and refrozen, leaving a layer of crystallized frost across his flanks. His breath was coming in long, labored pulls. His eyes were half closed. He was alive, but only in the way that something is alive when it has spent everything it had. The woman leading him stopped when Silas reached them. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s maybe, with a narrow face that was wind-burned to a deep, raw pink across the cheekbones. Dark hair, what he could see of it under the hat. Eyes that were a very pale gray-green, the color of lichen on creek rock. And they were looking at him with a steadiness that was unusual in the circumstances, given that she'd clearly been walking through the cold for a long time. "This your horse?" she said. Her voice was direct, not flat exactly, but economical, like someone who'd learned that most things could be said in fewer words than people generally used. "He is," Silas said. He looked at Reckoner. The stallion turned his head slightly at the sound of his voice and made a low, exhausted sound in his throat. "Where'd you find him?" "Up in the meridian timber, about 1.5 miles past the upper fork." She paused. He'd gotten into a gully. The snow collapsed a ledge above it, and he couldn't get out. "You dug him out." "I had a shovel." She said it like this was an obvious thing to keep in a saddlebag. Maybe for her it was. "Where's your horse?" "I came on foot." Silas looked at her. "From the meridian timber?" "Yes." "In this weather?" "The weather was worse 6 hours ago," she said. "This is better." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at Reckoner again, then back at her. She was swaying slightly. Not dramatically, but a careful observer could see it. The kind of sway that happens when a person's legs are at the end of what they have to give, and the only thing keeping them upright is the decision not to fall. "Come inside," he said. "I don't need to." "You walked 5 miles in a blizzard to bring back my horse," Silas said. "You're coming inside." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the distinct impression that she was calculating something, running numbers he couldn't see. And then she nodded once. "All right." Her name was Nora Ashcroft. She told him that much, and not much else, sitting at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, while he stood across the room giving her the space that seemed appropriate, given that she didn't look like a person who was accustomed to being in small rooms with strangers. She'd taken off the canvas coat. Under it she wore a plain wool shirt and canvas trousers tucked into boots that were wet through. There was a cut on her left hand along the base of the thumb that she'd wrapped in a strip of cloth sometime during the journey. The cloth was dark and stiff. "That needs cleaning," Silas said, nodding at her hand. She looked down at it like she'd forgotten it was there. "It's all right." "It's not all right. It's infected if you leave it." He went to the cabinet and got out what he kept for wounds and brought it back to the table. She watched him approach without moving, the way a person does when they've trained themselves not to flinch. He cleaned the cut. She didn't make a sound. He bandaged it with clean cloth, and she thanked him without meeting his eyes. "You want food?" "If it's not trouble." "It's not." He put together what he had. Cold biscuits, sliced salt pork, some beans he'd kept warm at the back of the stove. She ate with a focus that told him she'd been running on fumes for longer than tonight. Not desperate, not embarrassing, just present in the way that people are when food is fuel and they needed fuel hours ago, and they're making up for it. "Where were you headed?" he asked, when she'd gotten through most of it. She looked up. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not. I'm asking anyway." She considered this. "West of here. I was looking for work." "Ranching work?" "Any kind." Silas looked at her hands now that they were wrapped around the mug again. Calloused. Not the kind of calluses you got from housework, or even from driving a wagon. Deep set, across the fingers and the palm, the calluses of someone who'd handled tools and ropes for years. "You know horses," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some. You found a spooked Morgan stallion in the dark, in a blizzard, on the far side of a mountain range, and dug him out of a gully collapse and walked him 5 miles home," Silas said. "That's not some." She looked at him with those pale gray-green eyes and didn't answer right away. "He was scared," she said finally. "He needed to know it was going to be okay. And you convinced him of that. I sat with him for a while, talked to him. Horses in that situation, they panic and they die, or they panic and hurt themselves, or they go still and wait for something to change. He went still. That's the kind of horse you can work with." Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved around the eaves in long, low pulls. The kitchen was warm. The fire in the stove ticked. "You can stay until the storm passes," he said. She opened her mouth. "Before you argue," he said, "I have a spare room. The bunkhouse has 4 men in it who I'd rather not disturb, and the temperature tonight is going to go below what a human body can handle if it's exposed. So," she closed her mouth. "Thank you," she said after a moment, in a tone that sounded like the words cost her something. The spare room was small. A single bed, a window that faced the north pasture, a braided rug on the plank floor. Silas had used it as a storage space until 2 years ago, when Hector had needed somewhere to sleep during a bout of illness. There was a quilt on the bed, heavy and faded. He left a candle on the windowsill. "There's a wash basin down the hall," he said from the doorway. "I'll find it." He started to go, then stopped. "The reward," he began. "I don't want a reward. I haven't said what it is." "I don't want it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was nothing soft about it. He needed to get home. Now he's home. That's all. Silas looked at her. She was standing beside the bed, still upright, still composed, though he could see that it was costing her more now than it had been in the kitchen. The edges of a person show eventually. "All right," he said. He went down the hall to his room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a while before he took off his boots. He'd met a lot of people in 41 years. He'd hired hands and fired them, bought cattle from men and sold it to others, argued with neighbors and made peace with them, and in some cases lost them entirely. He'd had dealings with drifters and merchants and lawmen, and one particularly memorable federal surveyor who'd had the navigational instincts of a drunk rooster. He thought he had a reasonable working understanding of how people were put together. Nora Ashcroft did not quite fit any arrangement he recognized. It wasn't that she was mysterious exactly. People who perform mystery were easy enough to see through. It was more that she seemed genuinely indifferent to how she appeared. She hadn't deflected or performed modesty when he'd acknowledged what she'd done with the horse. She'd just stated the facts of it, as if the facts were what they were, and didn't require any additional presentation. She hadn't offered information about herself that he hadn't asked for, but she also hadn't been cagey about the things he did ask. She'd walked 5 miles in a blizzard to bring back a stranger's horse and refused a reward, and asked for nothing but a place to wait out the cold. That was either the most straightforward thing in the world or the most complicated. Silas lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind. She was up before anyone else in the morning. He came downstairs at first light and found the kitchen already warm. She'd built the fire back up, and the coffee already made. He stood in the doorway for a moment, surprised, and she looked up from the table where she was sitting with a cup of her own. "Hope that's all right," she said. "It's more than all right." He poured a cup and sat down across from her. Through the window, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the snow had stopped during the night. The valley stretched out flat and white under the early light. "How's the stallion?" she asked. "Checked him an hour ago," she said. He looked at her. "I woke early. I wanted to see how he'd come through the night. I hope that was... It's fine. He's doing better. He ate. That's good." "Yes," Silas said. "That's good." He drank his coffee and she drank hers, and they sat in the quiet for a while without it being uncomfortable, which was notable because silence with a near stranger was usually uncomfortable in his experience. "Where were you before here?" he asked. She turned the cup in her hands. "Around? Around where?" "East of here mostly. Montana for a while. Sometime in Wyoming." "Ranching?" "Some ranching, some freight work, some..." She paused. "Other things." He didn't push it. The way she'd said other things was the only moment so far where her voice had gone careful in a way that suggested the territory beyond it wasn't open. Later that morning, his hands were out checking the pasture fences for blizzard damage, and Silas found himself in the barn, ostensibly reviewing the inventory, actually watching through the open door as Nora moved around the yard with a purpose that didn't seem to require instruction. She'd found a snow shovel somewhere and was clearing the path from the barn to the bunkhouse, not because anyone had asked her, just because it needed doing and she was there. Reckoner, in his stall, had begun tracking her movements. His ears followed her. His head swung toward the sound of her boots on the packed snow. The stallion, who had bitten Hector Del Rey twice and who viewed most new people as an imposition on his time, was watching Nora Ashcroft with something that looked almost like curiosity. Silas leaned against the barn wall and drank his second cup of coffee. She stayed 3 days. The storm left enough aftermath: drifted road, iced-over creek crossings, a toppled section of fence on the east side that needed setting before the cattle found it, that nobody was going anywhere quickly, and Nora seemed disinclined to press for the sake of pressing. She worked. That was the thing. She didn't ask to help and then stand around waiting to be directed. She looked at what was in front of her and got into it. On the second day, she was in the barn helping Hector reset a water trough that had cracked in the freeze when Silas overheard her explaining to the younger hand, Cole, why the angle of the trough mount was causing the overflow problem. She drew it out in the dirt of the barn floor with her finger, quick, clean lines, a practical diagram. Cole looked at it and said, "Oh," in the way people do when they've understood something they've been doing wrong for years. On the third day, Silas's neighbor from the ranch to the northwest, a broad, red-faced man named Amos Trent, came by to check on the fence line they shared and to gossip, which was Amos's secondary occupation. He stood in the yard and watched Nora come out of the south barn carrying a length of chain and registered an opinion without being asked. That the woman who brought back your horse? Amos said. Yes. She got a name? Nora Ashcroft. Amos chewed the inside of his cheek. Don't know the name. Where's she from? Around, Silas said. Amos looked at him sideways. Margaret Holt's not going to like this. Silas looked at him. Like what? You having a woman out here that isn't... Amos waved his hand. You know. She brought back my horse. She's staying until the roads are clear. Sure, Amos said, in a tone that meant he had fully formed a different theory and intended to share it with everyone he knew. She left on the fourth morning while the fog was still low across the valley and the sun was just beginning to cut through it in long, slanted columns. Silas had saddled one of his spare horses, a calm gray mare named Dust, and brought her out. Nora looked at the horse and then at him. I said I didn't need... The roads are clear enough to ride, but not comfortable to walk, he said. Take her to the next town. Leave her at the livery there and send word. I'll have someone come get her. She stood there for a moment with her canvas coat on and her bag over her shoulder and her battered hat pulled straight, and she looked at Dust, and then she looked at him. There was something working through her expression that he couldn't read, and that she clearly had no intention of explaining. All right, she said. She tied her bag to the saddle and took the reins and mounted up in one clean motion, the kind that doesn't think about itself. There's work coming this spring, Silas said. He hadn't planned to say it. Calving season, fence repair, the usual. I'll need more hands. She looked down at him from the saddle. I'm saying if you're looking for work, he said. There's work here. She didn't answer right away. The mare shifted under her and she steadied it with a slight pressure of her knee without looking down. I'll think about it, she said. Then she turned the horse and rode out, down the access road, into the fog, until the gray of the mare and the dark of her coat merged with the gray and dark of the morning, and he couldn't separate them anymore. The town found out, of course. Towns find out everything, eventually, and Ridgeholm had developed a particular interest in Silas Boone's personal affairs that had only intensified since Margaret Holt had told her friend Dolores Pruitt about her visit to the ranch, and Dolores had told everyone else. By the time Amos Trent came through on his way to the Mercantile 2 days after Nora left, the story had been told, revised, embellished, and told again until it had acquired several details that Silas did not recognize, and a general emotional tenor of righteous grievance. The grievance was simple. Silas Boone had turned away every respectable woman in the valley and then allowed a strange woman, an outsider, a woman nobody knew anything about, to stay at his ranch for 4 days, under his roof, alone. With 4 hired hands in the bunkhouse, yes, but still. Margaret Holt did not come to Silas directly. She was more reserved than Dolores, who was not reserved at all. Dolores showed up at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon under the pretense of checking on something about the water rights issue that had been dormant for 2 years and that she had clearly brought back to life specifically for this visit. She sat in his parlor in a good wool dress and accepted the coffee he offered and then started talking about how she'd heard there had been a woman out here and she just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything is fine, Silas said. Who was she? A woman who found my horse. Where did she come from? The blizzard, as far as I can tell. Dolores gave him a look that could have stripped bark from a pine. Silas, I'm asking as a friend. No, you're not, he said, not unkindly. You're asking because you and the others are upset that I let a stranger stay here and didn't let any of you. And I understand that, honestly. But she didn't ask to stay. She was trying not to. I made her. Why? He thought about this. Because she'd walked 5 miles in the dark in a blizzard carrying a horse she found in a gully. Because she was more tired than she'd admit, and it was going to be well below freezing that night, because it was the right thing to do. Dolores set down her coffee cup. And that's all. That's all. She left in a state of dignified dissatisfaction, and Silas went back to the paperwork he'd been doing when she arrived, which was a calculation of how many calves he was likely to get this spring based on the previous year's numbers and the current state of the herd. The math took his attention, and he let it. 3 weeks later, Nora came back. She arrived on a clear, cold morning in March with her bag on her back and a no-nonsense expression and asked him if the offer of work was still standing. It is, he said. I can start today. You can start after breakfast." She came in and ate without ceremony and went out an hour later with Hector, who showed her what needed doing and who she'd be working alongside. By noon, she was 3 fence posts deep on the east line, working at a pace that made the younger hands recalibrate what pace was possible. By evening, she'd covered more ground than anyone had expected. Hector came to Silas that night with an expression of measured surprise. "She knows what she's doing," he said. "I know," Silas said. "I mean, she really knows." She checked the tension on the wire sections before she started and pointed out 2 spots I'd missed that were going to fail in spring thaw. "I know," Silas said again. Hector thought about this for a moment. "Where'd she come from?" "I'm not sure," Silas said. "She doesn't say much." "She says what needs saying." Hector looked at him with the expression of a man who has learned over many years how much and how little it was worth expressing an opinion to his employer. He chose less. "Night," he said. "Night," Silas said. "Nte." The trouble was already moving toward them, though nobody on the Boone Ranch knew it yet. It had been moving for a while, building in the low country to the south where the Carver Valley narrowed and the ranches were smaller and the distances between neighbors were longer. Men had been losing cattle, not to weather, not to predators, but to theft. Clean, professional theft, carried out at night in small numbers, so it took months before anyone realized the losses weren't just accounting errors or strays that had wandered. By the time 2 ranchers to the south had compared notes and realized their numbers had been declining at the same rate on the same schedule, the operation had been running for over a year. Silas had heard about it in February, secondhand from a man named Garrett who ran a small spread along the valley's eastern edge. Garrett had lost 11 cattle over the winter and hadn't known it until a full count in January. He was furious in the way men get when they've been made to feel foolish, which is a different and more dangerous kind of anger than the kind that comes from simple loss. Silas had put extra attention on his own numbers after that conversation. His count was clean, for now. But the Boone Ranch bordered some of the same open range the thieves were using, and the north pasture pushed up against terrain that would make excellent cover for a night operation. He didn't say anything about this to Nora. It was his business, his problem, his land. She was there for calving season and fence repair. What he noticed, though, was that she noticed things. That was the simplest way to put it. She paid attention to the land with a focused specificity that went beyond what her job required. When they rode the fence line together, which happened more than either of them had initially anticipated since they found that they moved at the same pace and made the same kinds of observations and didn't need to fill the silences between those observations with noise, she would stop and look at the pasture beyond the wire with an expression that was reading something he couldn't quite see. "What?" he said once when he noticed. She pointed toward a gap in the tree line at the north edge of the pasture, a low, dark space where 2 stands of timber didn't quite meet. "That's a good approach. If someone wanted to move cattle out of here without being seen." Silas looked at the gap. It was exactly what she'd said. "You've thought about this kind of thing before," he said. She kept her eyes on the tree line. "I've thought about a lot of things." He didn't push it. He was learning the shape of where she stopped and where she started, and he was learning it with a patience that surprised him, given that patience had never been his strongest quality, and most people didn't earn it from him this quickly. They rode back in the late afternoon with the light going copper and orange across the snow that was still holding in the north-facing hollows, and the horses moved easy under them, and Silas thought about what it meant that he'd been out on his own land for 3 hours, and had not once felt the dull, persistent loneliness that had been his company for most of 7 years. He thought about it, and then he put it somewhere to think about later, because later seemed like the right time for that particular thought, and today still had things in it that needed his attention. It was Hector who first said anything, and he said it with enough reluctance that Silas knew he'd been sitting on it for a while. "People are talking about her," Hector said, one evening in the barn. "People talk," Silas said. "It's getting specific." Hector paused. "They're saying she used to run with frontier raiders, out of the Wyoming territory." Silas went still for a moment. Then he went back to what he was doing, which was checking the condition of a bit that had been feeling off. "Who's saying that?" "Brent Coulter's wife. She used to be from that area, Wyoming. She says she recognizes the name." "Brent Coulter's wife gossips." "She does," Hector agreed, "but she says she's sure." Silas set down the bit. What does it change? Hector looked at him carefully. For you? Maybe nothing. For the town doesn't run this ranch. No, Hector said. But the town is where we sell cattle and buy supplies and file legal papers and generally exist, so. It was a fair point, and Silas acknowledged it was a fair point, which he demonstrated by not arguing with it. I'll talk to her, he said. He didn't do it immediately. He sat with it for a day, which was how long it took him to figure out how to have the conversation without it feeling like an accusation or an interrogation, since both of those things would make her close up in ways that wouldn't help anyone. He finally brought it up on a Wednesday afternoon, out on the fence line, where the open air and the work and the absence of walls made these conversations feel less like they were about being trapped. There are stories about you, he said, without preamble. She kept walking, checking the wire. What kind? That you ran with a raider crew out of Wyoming. A long pause. She stopped at a fence post, tested the tension on the wire. A crew that raided other people, she said carefully, or a crew that was raiding from. What's the difference? The difference is everything. She turned and looked at him. Her expression was not defensive, but it was serious, more serious than he'd seen it before. I was with people who lived outside what the law in that territory considered legal. Not because I had a choice at the beginning, and then because I was there and it was what I knew, and then because she stopped, started again. I got out 3 years ago. I've been moving since then. Silas looked at her. I haven't done anything worth hunting, she said. I haven't hurt anyone who wasn't trying to hurt me or the people around me. That's the truth, as I know how to give it. The wind came across the pasture and moved through the dry winter grass, and then it was quiet again. All right, he said. You believe me? I don't know yet, he said, but I'm not in the habit of deciding what I believe before I've had a chance to watch a person. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. What I've seen is what I've seen. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, barely, like a door that opens a 1/4 inch and then stops. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went back to the fence line. Go on. Spring came in early April with mud and calves and the particular chaos that descends on any working ranch when a season changes and everything needs doing at once. Silas was up before light every morning and not done until the dark was back, and the hands were the same, and Nora worked the same schedule without complaint and with a competency that had stopped surprising him, but that he still noticed. The cattle losses hadn't reached him yet, but 3 more ranches in the valley had reported shortfalls, all of them careful, measured men who didn't miscount. And the running total was now significant enough that it wasn't possible to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Silas had started paying attention to the north pasture at night. He didn't mention this to anyone. He'd ride out late, when the hands were down, and take a slow circuit of the fence line with a lantern off and only the moon for light, which was enough when the sky was clear. He did this 4 nights before he found what he'd been looking for and dreading in equal parts. Tracks. Not cattle tracks, boot tracks and horse tracks, from the north, coming through the gap in the timber that Nora had pointed out 6 weeks ago. They came in, moved along the inside of the fence line, and went back out. No cattle had moved, his count was still clean, but the tracks told him the operation had been scouted, had already been looked at and measured and found worth noting. He stood in the north pasture at midnight with his lantern dark in his hand and looked at the tracks in the cold mud and felt the quiet, specific fear of a man who has something real to lose. He went back to the house. Nora was sitting on the porch steps when he got there, which startled him enough that he stopped short. She had a blanket around her shoulders and a cup in her hands, and she was looking at the dark sky with its thick scatter of stars. You've been going out at night, she said. You've noticed. I'm a light sleeper. He sat down on the step beside her, which required a certain redistribution of the space between them, since the steps weren't wide. She moved slightly to make room without making it an event. I found tracks, he said. She went still. North pasture. They came through the gap you pointed out. He paused. They haven't moved any cattle yet, but they've been looking. She turned the cup in her hands. The night was cold enough that her breath showed, and his, 2 separate clouds in the dark. How many sets of tracks? She asked. 4 horses. Maybe 6 men. She was quiet for a moment. That's a small advance party. They use those to scout the approach and confirm the herd count before they bring the full crew. He looked at her. I know how it works, she said, meeting his eyes without apology. I know you do, he said. They sat there on the cold steps under the winter stars, and the valley stretched away dark and still in every direction. And somewhere out in the north pasture, the cattle made the low, quiet sounds they made at night when nothing was disturbing them. I'll need to know when they come, Silas said. Yes, Nora said. I'll need to know what to expect. I'll tell you what I can. The cold settled around them. Neither of them moved to go inside. For what it's worth, she said after a while, I'm sorry the tracks are there. Not your fault. No, she agreed, but they're still there. Silas leaned his elbows on his knees and looked out at the dark and thought about what was coming and what it would cost and what he was not willing to lose. He thought about Reckoner in a gully in a blizzard, going still and waiting for something to change. He thought about a woman walking 5 miles through the dark to bring a horse home. Some things, he thought, you couldn't calculate in advance. You could only see what was coming and decide, before it arrived, who you were going to be when it got there. He'd already started deciding. The tracks were gone by morning, not brushed away. The overnight freeze had locked them in place, and then a thin new skin of frost had settled over everything and made the pasture look untouched. But Silas knew what was under there, and knowing changed the way he moved through his own land. He found himself checking the north fence line twice before breakfast and once more at midday. Not because anything would have changed, but because standing there made him feel like he was doing something, which was better than the alternative. Nora didn't mention the conversation on the porch steps. She came to breakfast the same as always, early, quiet, useful, and went out with the others to continue the calving work that had taken over the rhythm of the ranch since the first week of April. She didn't treat him differently, and she didn't look at him like she was waiting for him to act on whatever they'd established the night before. She just worked. He found that he appreciated this more than he could easily explain. The calving season had a way of making everything else feel secondary. It was exhausting and relentless and occasionally heartbreaking. A calf born wrong, a first-time heifer in distress, a night spent in the cold barn with a lantern and not enough sleep, and no guarantee of a good outcome. Silas had done it for 16 years, and it still had the power to hollow him out by the end of the first week. The hands rotated the night watch in shifts, but Silas was never entirely off it. Not really, because the ranch was his, and the animals were his, and the losses landed differently when they were yours. Nora took the second night watch without being asked, on the 3rd day of calving, when Cole came in sick with a stomach ailment that left him useless, and Dobbs had been up the 2 nights previous and was running on fumes. She came to Silas in the late afternoon and said, simply, that she'd take it. You've been up since 5, he said. So have you. It's my ranch. It's my watch, she said, and went back to what she'd been doing. He let her. He was up at 2 in the morning anyway, the way he always was during calving, and he found her in the south barn with a lantern propped on a post and a calf that had been born breech an hour earlier and was now, improbably, upright and nursing. Nora was crouched in the straw nearby, watching it with the concentrated attention of someone who didn't entirely trust good outcomes until they'd lasted a while. You turned it? He asked. Mostly the mother did. I just helped. She paused. She knew what she was doing. I stayed out of it until she needed another set of hands. Silas watched the calf for a moment. It was wobbly and wet-eared and entirely committed to the business of existing. Go get some sleep, he said. I've got it. She stood, brushed straw from her knees, picked up her lantern. She was moving toward the barn door when she stopped. Silas, he looked up. Be careful with the north pasture, she said. They won't wait much longer. Spring works in their favor. The mud covers tracks better than frost does. Then she went out, and he stood in the barn with the calf and its mother and the sound of the other animals settling around him. And he thought about timing and mud and the particular patience of men who made their living taking other people's things. The first rumors arrived in Ridgeholm before May did. Silas heard about them from Amos Trent, who stopped by on a Tuesday under the pretense of wanting to discuss the shared water situation along their boundary creek, which was a perennial topic that neither of them had strong feelings about, but which served as useful cover for other conversations. Amos had barely dismounted before he got to it. "People are talking about your hired woman," he said. "I know." "Not just the widow situation," Amos said, which told Silas immediately that Brent Coulter's wife had been busy. "There's a story going around that she used to ride with Decker's crew." Silas had heard of Decker. Most people in this part of the frontier had a raider operation out of Wyoming that had been active for the better part of a decade, hitting freight wagons and isolated ranches and occasionally something larger. They'd been broken up about 3 years ago by a combination of bad luck and territorial marshals. Most of the crew had scattered. "What are they saying exactly?" Silas asked. "That she rode with them for 2 years, that she's dangerous." Amos paused. "That you've got a wolf sleeping in your barn and you're too stubborn or too—" He stopped himself. "Too what?" Amos looked uncomfortable. "Too taken with her to see it straight." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "Amos, in 16 years, have you ever seen me make a decision about this ranch that wasn't straight?" "No," Amos said honestly. "Then I'd appreciate it if you told people that." Amos chewed his cheek. "I'll try. But Margaret Holt is telling anyone who'll listen that she refuses to believe a respectable man would knowingly—" "Margaret Holt," Silas said carefully, "has made several visits to this ranch that I didn't invite and hasn't once asked me what I actually think about things. She's formed opinions about my ranch and the people on it from the outside. I don't need her approval to hire who I hire." Amos held up his hands in a peace gesture. "I'm just telling you what's out there." "I know," Silas said. "I appreciate it." They talked about the creek boundary for 20 minutes after that, and then Amos rode back toward his property, and Silas stood in the yard for a while looking at nothing in particular before he went back inside. He didn't tell Nora about the conversation. He'd considered it and decided against it on the grounds that it would accomplish nothing except to make her feel like a liability, and she wasn't one. But he could tell, in the days that followed, that she was hearing things. She came back from a supply run to Ridgeholm, the second one she'd done since starting work, accompanying coal for the wagon, with a particular quietness about her that was different from her usual quietness. The usual kind was just economy. This was something being held back. He found her that evening in the small lean-to off the south barn, checking harness leather for the next day's work. She did this kind of maintenance without being asked, which was one of the things that had made her indispensable before anyone had officially decided she was. "How was town?" he said. She kept working. "Fine." Cole said there was some trouble at the mercantile. She was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Coulter was there. She said some things." Another pause. "Loudly." "What things?" Nora set down the harness, turned to look at him. "That you're being made a fool of. That I'm using your hospitality to set up something." She wasn't specific about what. That the decent women of this valley are watching a criminal take advantage of a widower who doesn't know any better. Her voice was even throughout all of this, which was clearly an effort. Cole told her to mind her business. I told him not to bother. "Why not bother?" "Because arguing with her would look like guilt," she said. "And walking away looks like guilt too, so it doesn't matter what I do. She's already decided." She looked at him steadily. "Maybe she's right to." "She's not. You don't know everything about where I've been, Silas." "No," he said, "but I know what I've watched for 6 weeks. I know what a person looks like when they're running a con and what they look like when they're just working." He met her eyes. "You're just working." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away first, which was the only time he'd ever seen her do that. "The women in town are going to keep pushing," she said quietly. "They've got reason to. I'm not one of them. I've never pretended to be, and I'm living and working on your ranch while every one of them has been trying to get a foothold here for 3 years. That's not nothing." "I know it's not. So I'm asking you directly." She looked back at him. "Is this going to be a problem? For the ranch? For you?" Silas considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, which was without rushing it. "The ranch is fine," he said, and I'm not in the habit of making decisions about who I hire based on what people in town decide to feel. She was quiet. That's not an answer to whether it's a problem, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. The answer to that is, I don't know yet, but I'm not sending you away over gossip, so it doesn't much matter right now. She picked up the harness again. The lantern swung slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows moved. Okay, she said. The formal delegation from town arrived on a Friday. Silas had been half expecting it, in the way you expect a storm you can smell coming. It was 3 people: Dolores Pruitt, which surprised him, Reverend Gale's wife Hannah, which did not, and a rancher named Walter Foss, who had apparently been volunteered by someone for reasons that weren't entirely clear, since Foss was a mild-mannered man who clearly wanted to be somewhere else. They came in a buckboard and parked it in the yard, and Dolores got down from it with the deliberate authority of a woman who has prepared her remarks. Silas stood on the porch and waited. We're not here to cause trouble, Dolores began. Good, he said. We're here as people who care about this community and about you personally, Silas, and we think there are some things that need to be said. All right. The woman you've hired, Nora Ashcroft. Dolores said the name carefully, as if it might behave unpredictably. We have serious concerns about her history and what her presence here means for the safety of— What specifically? Silas said. Dolores paused. What? What specific concern? Not general, specific. He looked at her steadily. Has she stolen something, threatened someone, caused any damage you can point to? There are credible reports. From Brent Coulter's wife, Silas said, who has never been to Wyoming as far as I know, and who heard the name Ashcroft somewhere and built a case around it. He kept his voice level. I know about her background. She's told me what she's told me, and what I've observed tells me the rest. What she's told you, Hannah Gale said, in the tone of a woman deeply skeptical of what anyone would tell you. Silas, these kinds of people are skilled at— These kinds of people, Silas repeated. Hannah had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I've got 4 hands on this ranch, Silas said. I've had high and low caliber men work this land over 16 years, and I know which is which. I'm asking you to trust my judgment on the people I employ, the same as you trusted on everything else. Walter Foss, who had said nothing, chose this moment to look very intently at the ground. Dolores looked at Silas for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was more complicated than simple disapproval, something that was maybe closer to genuine concern. He recognized it and acknowledged it internally without letting it change anything. You're going to do what you're going to do, she said finally. That's generally how it works, he said. And when something goes wrong, if something goes wrong, he said, I'll deal with it. That's what I do. Dolores pressed her lips together. Then she turned and got back in the buckboard with a composure that cost her something, Silas could see. Hannah followed. Walter Foss climbed up after them with the look of a man who had endured something and was grateful it was over. Silas watched them go. Behind him, the screen door didn't move, but he was aware that it could. He'd seen the shadow shift behind the window when they'd arrived. That evening, he told Nora what had happened in plain terms without editorializing. She listened. Then she said, You should have let me talk to them. No, he said. It would have helped if they'd seen that I wasn't— It wouldn't have helped, he said. Nothing you said would have mattered. It's not about what you say. It's about the fact that you're here. He paused. Some of them are going to come around. The others won't. Either way, I'm not managing this ranch by committee. She was quiet for a moment. Silas, she said, I can leave. If it's making things harder— It's making things more complicated, he said. Complicated and harder aren't the same thing. He looked at her. I need someone who knows how cattle thieves operate watching the north pasture. I need someone who can work a calving season without falling apart. I need someone who doesn't need to be told twice about anything. He paused. You're the only person on this ranch who covers all 3, so I need you to stay. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, not moved exactly, but altered in some small way, like something that had been braced against impact and found instead that it wasn't coming. All right, she said, for what felt like the 100th time, but this time it meant something different, and they both knew it. It was 2 days later that Silas came to her with a different kind of problem. He'd been tracking the cattle thefts across the valley for weeks, quietly, carefully, building a picture from the reports he gathered when he talked to other ranchers and from what he observed on his own land. The picture that had assembled itself was specific and organized and spoke to someone with real experience running this kind of operation across a wide range of terrain. "They're not random," he told her, spreading a rough map across the kitchen table, his own hand-drawn version, marking the ranches that had been hit and the dates he knew about. They hit in rotation, always night, always the same general direction of departure, north or northwest, up into the high country. Nora studied the map. "Where are they holding the cattle?" "That's the question." "There's terrain up in the Meridian Range." She stopped, traced a line on the map with one finger. "There's a bowl up here, north of where I found Reckoner. It's sheltered, there's water, it's not visible from any trail. You could hold 300 head in there for weeks before anyone found them." Silas looked at her. "How do you know that?" She met his eyes. "I've been up in that range." He let that sit. "I need to go up there," he said. "Not alone." "I wasn't planning on going alone." She studied the map again. "If you go and they're there, they'll know the ranches in the valley are paying attention. They'll move faster, or they'll move against you specifically." "I know. And if you go and they're not there yet, you've tipped your hand for nothing." "I know that too." She straightened up from the map, looked at him directly. "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I need to find out how big this operation is before I do anything else," he said. "I'm thinking I need to talk to the other ranchers, the ones who've been hit, and get them to actually coordinate instead of each handling it privately like everyone's been doing. They won't like it. No, they'll like losing cattle more." She almost smiled, not quite. "When?" "I'll start riding out next week. Hit the 3 ranches to the south, then the 2 east of here. Make the case." He paused. "I need you here." Something shifted in her expression. "Here. I'll be gone several days. The hands are good, but they're not—" He thought about how to say it. "They don't have your read on things. If something moves on the north pasture, I need someone who'll know what it means." It was the most direct thing he'd said to her about what she represented to this operation. He watched her absorb it. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded once, started to fold the map. She put her hand flat on it. "Silas?" He looked up. "Be careful who you trust when you're out there. Someone's been feeding this crew information. They know which ranches to hit and when the counts are low and where the hands aren't watching. That's not all guesswork." He hadn't thought of it that way. He did now. "You think someone in the valley is working with them?" "I think it's possible," she said. "It would explain the precision." He sat back and looked at the map and felt the particular cold that comes when something you thought was external turns out to be much closer than that. "Good to know," he said. "Not really," she said, "but it's better to know than not." He rode out on a Monday with 2 days' supplies and no announcement to anyone except Hector, who he trusted to keep it quiet. He told Nora he'd be back by Thursday. He left her standing in the yard watching him go, with the morning light behind her and the north pasture stretching wide and open beyond the fence line, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had made decisions in his life that looked like good decisions and turned out to be bad ones, and decisions that looked like bad ones and turned out to be the only thing that saved him. He couldn't say yet which this was. He rode north and then turned east, and the ranch fell behind him, and somewhere to the south the valley was quiet in a way that wouldn't last. Silas had been gone 2 days when Nora found the second set of tracks. These weren't like the first ones. Careful, measured, a scouting party testing the approach. These came in from 2 directions at once, from the north gap and from the lower tree line on the western edge of the pasture, and they were heavier. More horses. More weight. She crouched in the mud at the fence line in the early morning gray and counted the impressions and felt something tighten low in her chest that she recognized from years ago, from a different life, from the particular sensation of realizing that a situation had stopped being theoretical. She stood up and looked at the ranch, the house, the south barn, the north barn, the bunkhouse, the smokehouse, The water trough at the center of the yard with the irrigation channel that Silas had dug 3 years ago running east from it along the base of the south fence. The hay stacked in the open lean-to between the two barns. The cattle in the north pasture, maybe 200 head, moving slow and easy in the morning cold. She looked at all of it the way she used to look at terrain when she was 17 and learning, from people who knew worse things than she did, how to read a landscape for what it could do. Then she went to find Hector. He was in the south barn, and she told him what she'd found without preamble. He listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and then said what she'd expected him to say. "We should send for Silas. By the time someone rides out and finds him and comes back, it'll be tonight," she said. "Maybe tomorrow morning. These tracks are from last night. They're not scouting anymore." Hector was quiet. "How many men, you think?" he said finally. "More than us," she said. "A lot more." He looked at her. She looked back. She could see him calculating the gap between what he knew about her and what he didn't know, and she understood that calculation because she'd been living inside it since she arrived. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. She spent the morning moving through the ranch with a focus that left no room for the other thing. The low-grade fear that she'd been managing since she saw the tracks, that she was keeping to one side like a fire you don't let spread. There wasn't time for it. There was only the work. The irrigation channel first. Silas had dug it 3 summers ago to run water from the main trough to the south pasture, and it ran along the base of the south fence in a shallow trench, about 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide. She walked its length and measured it against what she was planning and decided it would do. She had Cole and Dobbs extend it at the eastern end, pushing it another 20 yards toward the corner of the yard. They didn't ask why. She told them enough to keep them working and saved the rest. The hay in the lean-to was dry. Weeks of low humidity had pulled the moisture out of it until it would go up fast and hot. She didn't touch it yet. She just noted it and moved on. The cattle were her biggest problem and her biggest asset at the same time. 200 head of cattle in a confined pasture, spooked hard enough, would move in a direction and they would keep moving in that direction, and anything in their path would have a bad night. The question was direction. She spent an hour on the north pasture fence, identifying which sections were solid and which were compromised. There were 2 spots on the east side where the posts had settled over the winter and the wire had loosened. She didn't fix them. Hector watched her leave those sections alone and came to her with his eyebrows doing something complicated. "Those need—" "I know," she said. "Leave them." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to run the cattle through there." "If I need to." "Into what?" She told him the rest of it then, standing at the fence line with the spring wind coming across the pasture and the cattle moving in the middle distance, and she watched his face go through several stages before it settled into something that was not quite confidence and not quite the opposite. "That's either the smartest thing I've ever heard," he said, "or we're all going to die." "Probably somewhere between," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before." She didn't answer immediately. "I've been on the other side of it," she said, "which is close enough. They came at dusk. She'd expected night, full dark, the way raids usually worked, and the early timing threw her for half a second when Dobbs came running from the north barn, saying there were riders coming down from the tree line. Then she understood. They'd seen Silas leave. They knew the count of hands. They'd decided dusk was safer than midnight because dusk still had enough light to work by and was early enough that any response from the valley would take time to organize. Smart. She'd have made the same call. She had 4 men, Hector, Cole, Dobbs, and a hand named Prentice, who was young and scared and trying not to show it. She put them where she'd put them and told them what she'd told them, and then she went to her own position, which was the roof of the south barn. She'd climbed it an hour earlier and confirmed what she'd thought. From up there you could see the full yard, the north pasture, the approach from the west, and most of the access road. You could also be seen, which was a problem she'd solved with the canvas she'd pulled from the hay lean-to and draped across the ridgeline in a way that looked like it was there for weather. She lay flat on the roof with the canvas above her and watched them come. There were more than she'd counted on. That was the first thing. She'd estimated based on the track weight and the approach pattern, and she'd come up with 15, maybe 18. What came out of the timber and across the north pasture fence was closer to 25, possibly more. They were spread wide and moving in a loose formation that was designed to encircle rather than charge. Someone who knew what they were doing had planned this. The second thing she noticed was the leader. He was riding a gray horse at the center of the formation, and even from a distance and in the failing light, she could see the way the others oriented to him. Small adjustments, horses angled slightly toward his position, eyes checking back. He was a tall man, sitting straight in the saddle, and he was moving with the ease of someone who had done this many times and expected this time to be the same. She knew the type. She'd ridden with men who moved like that. She knew what they were thinking right now, which was, one man's ranch, 4 hands, a woman, be done in an hour. She let them get into the yard. She let them get all the way in, spread across the open ground between the barn and the bunkhouse, before she lit the first torch and dropped it into the irrigation channel. She'd put lamp oil in the channel 2 hours earlier. Not a lot. Enough to burn fast and bright. Not enough to get out of hand. The fire caught and ran along the channel like something alive, east to west, and in the space of 3 seconds there was a wall of fire running along the south fence line that was close enough to the rider's flank to make their horses lose their minds. The horses went first. That was always how it worked. A horse doesn't reason about fire the way a person does. It just goes, and it goes hard, and if you're on it, you go with it, whether you want to or not. The eastern half of the formation dissolved instantly into rearing, spinning chaos, men cursing and hauling on reins that weren't helping. Then Nora put a torch into the dry hay in the lean-to. That one went up big. A column of fire and smoke that lit the whole yard orange and sent a rolling wave of heat across the open ground. The horses that had been managing their fear stopped managing it. The cattle in the north pasture, already pushed to the edge of the herd's tolerance by the noise and the smell, hit the 2 loose sections of east fence and went through them. 200 cattle moving fast in the dark in a panic are not a wall of sound so much as they are a wall of everything. Hooves and bodies, and the particular low roar of animals that have gone past fear into something more fundamental. They came through the fence sections, and they turned east, which was what she'd counted on, because east was open ground and east was where the eastern half of the raider formation was still struggling with its horses. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean. It was chaos applied to chaos with the intention of making the result slightly favor one side over the other. Hector and Cole and Dobbs, from their positions at the bunkhouse in the north barn, opened up with rifles. Not charging, not heroic, just laying down enough noise and fire from enough different directions that the formation's center couldn't tell what it was dealing with or where the threat was coming from. That was all she'd asked them to do. Make the middle uncertain, make the leader uncertain. She came down off the barn roof at the back end and came around the south side and got to the access road and cut it. She'd set a rope across it earlier, tied to the fence post on one side and attached on the other to a length of chain that she'd weighted with a fence post anchor. When she pulled the rope, the chain came up and the post anchor swung wide and the combination crossed the road at knee height to a horse. 2 horses hit it in the first 30 seconds and went down, and the riders behind them pulled up hard and the road became impassable. The whole thing lasted maybe 12 minutes. That was the part she never could explain adequately later, when people asked. It felt like much longer while it was happening. There were moments in the middle of it that felt like they lasted an hour each, moments when she was moving through smoke and noise, and she couldn't see clearly, and she didn't know where everyone was, and she had to keep going anyway, because stopping was worse. But when it was over, and the night had gone mostly quiet, except for the distant sound of cattle still moving on the eastern plain, she counted back, and it was 12 minutes from the first torch to the last rider clearing the access road. 25 armed men, and she'd run them off a ranch with fire and cattle and a length of chain. She sat down in the dirt of the yard because her legs had decided they were done, and she put her hands flat on the ground and breathed. Hector found her there 2 minutes later. He had a cut above his eyebrow from something, and he was limping slightly on his left side, but he was upright and his eyes were clear. "Cole?" she said. "Fine. Scared, but fine." "Dobbs?" "Twisted his ankle, nothing broken." "Prentice?" He's okay. He's sitting on the bunkhouse steps, not talking." Hector paused. Give him a few minutes. She nodded, looked around the yard. The irrigation channel fire had burned itself out. The hay lean-to was gone, just a black frame and ash. The south barn had scorch marks along its lower west wall, but the structure was standing. The north fence had two large gaps where 200 cattle had gone through it and were currently somewhere on the eastern plain, which was going to be a significant problem at first light. "The ranch," she said. "We'll deal with it," Hector said. She looked at the gaps in the fence, at the scorched barn wall, at the mud churned up by the horses across the center of the yard, deep ruts in the soft spring ground. "I made a mess of his ranch," she said. It came out flat, not dramatic. It was just the fact of it, sitting on her chest. "You saved his ranch," Hector said. "What's the difference right now," she said, "between those two things?" Hector didn't answer that because there wasn't a good answer. She hadn't expected one. She got up off the ground because she'd been sitting for 3 minutes, and 3 minutes was as long as she had. Her left side was hurting in a way she hadn't noticed during the fight. She'd taken something, caught a glancing blow from something she hadn't seen clearly in the smoke, and now that the noise was over, her body was presenting her with the bill. She put her hand to her ribs and pressed and felt the bright specific pain of something cracked or badly bruised. "You're hurt," Hector said. "I know." "How bad?" "Manageable." She dropped her hand. "We need to check the north fence line for any of them who might have gone to ground, and someone needs to ride for Silas. I'll send Cole." She nodded, looked north toward the dark shape of the upper timber and the mountains beyond it, which were just visible as a slightly darker mass against the dark sky. She thought about the leader on the gray horse, the way he'd sat straight and easy coming across the pasture. She'd watched him in the chaos, watched him pull his horse around and look at the burning channel and the cattle breach and the fire, and he'd made a decision fast. She could see it, and the decision he'd made was retreat. He'd gotten most of his men out. Most, not all. 2 of the horses that had gone down at the road rope were without riders who seemed in any hurry to get back on them. That meant 2 men somewhere in the area, on foot, in the dark, who had not made the retreat. And somewhere to the south and east, several families from neighboring ranches were being held. She hadn't forgotten that. It had been sitting in the back of everything all evening like a debt she hadn't figured out how to pay yet. "There were families," she said to Hector. "I know." "When Silas gets back, I know," he said again. His voice was tired but not hopeless. "We'll figure it out." Thus, she stood in the wrecked yard of the Boone Ranch and looked at what the night had done to it, and felt the weight of it. The real weight. Not just the ribs, but the full accounting of what it had cost to keep this place standing for 12 minutes. The hay was gone. The fence was gone. 2 men were hiding somewhere in the dark, with reasons to be angry. The cattle were scattered across the eastern plain and would need days to bring back. And the man who ran the gray horse was still out there. He'd lost a battle tonight, but he hadn't lost the war. Men like that didn't lose wars over a single engagement. They recalculated and came back harder, and they came back with a specific kind of anger that was worse than the original plan because it was personal now. She knew that too, from the other side. Cole rode out within the hour. Prentice eventually came off the bunkhouse steps and helped Hector walk the perimeter in the dark, checking for the 2 missing riders. They found one of them, a young man, barely older than Prentice, sitting against the east fence with a broken wrist and the look of someone whose night had gone very differently than expected. They brought him in and put him in the barn, and Nora wrapped his wrist in clean cloth and told him to sit still, which he did because he had no other options that looked better. The second man they didn't find. That bothered her more than she showed. She climbed back up to the barn roof at midnight because it was the best vantage, and because lying down was difficult with the ribs, and because she didn't trust the dark enough yet to sleep in it. She sat with her back against the chimney stack and watched the tree line and listened to the ranch settle around her. The remaining horses in the north barn, Prentice walking a slow circuit of the yard below, the distant sound of cattle still spooked and moving somewhere east. The stars were out, cold and enormous, the way they get in that country when the air has been scoured clean by wind and there's nothing between you and everything above. She put her hand to her side and breathed carefully through the pain. Silas would be back tomorrow, if Cole found him by morning. Maybe the day after. She'd hold the ranch until then because that was what she'd said she'd do and because there wasn't an alternative that made sense. What came after was harder to map. The families to the south, the leader on the gray horse, the valley ranchers who were still trying to manage this individually when the problem had long since outgrown any individual solution. She sat on the roof of the barn and thought about all of it, and she thought about the fact that she'd spent 3 years trying to get far enough away from the life she'd come from that it wouldn't follow her anymore. And instead, she'd walked into a valley where the same calculus was running, just under different names. You couldn't outrun the thing you knew how to do. Eventually, the thing you knew how to do was the only thing that helped. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a tragedy or just the shape of how it was. The night held. The tree line stayed dark. Below her, the wrecked yard of the Boone Ranch sat quiet under the stars, holding its ground. Cole found him the next morning, 40 miles south on the Garrett spread, where Silas had spent the previous evening convincing a stubborn, grieving rancher named Emmett Garrett that the losses he'd been absorbing alone for 8 months were connected to losses every other man in the valley had been absorbing alone, and that the alone part was the problem. He heard the horse coming fast before he saw it, and he was already moving toward the door when Cole pulled up in the yard, lathered and wild-eyed, and said what he said. Silas didn't speak for a moment. He stood in Garrett's yard with his hat in his hand and processed the information. The raid, the fire, the cattle breach, the men, Nora's ribs. In the particular way he processed bad news, which was sequentially and without the luxury of feeling much about any individual piece until he'd gotten through all of them. "She's all right," Cole said again. "Hector says she's all right. But the ranch. I heard you." He put his hat back on. Looked at Garrett, who had come out to the porch. "I have to go." Garrett was a lean, weathered man in his 60s who had been skeptical all evening and had gone to bed still mostly skeptical, and who was now standing on his porch in the early morning looking at a young hand who'd ridden 40 miles through the night and a rancher who was already saddling up with a face like a closed door. "How many men did they send?" Garrett called. 25, Cole said. "Maybe more." Garrett was quiet for a moment, and one woman held them off. "Yes, sir." Another silence. "I'll ride with you," Garrett said to Silas. "Give me 10 minutes." Silas looked at him. Garrett looked back with the expression of a man who has made a decision and doesn't need it discussed. 10 minutes, Silas said. He pushed the horse harder than was kind and got to the Boone Ranch by mid-afternoon with Garrett behind him and the particular dread of a man who has been told things are all right and needs to see it for himself before he can believe it. The yard stopped him. Not because it was destroyed, it wasn't, quite, but because it had been clearly and violently remade by the night. The lean-to was ash and black timber. The south barn wore a long scorch mark along its western wall. The north fence was open in 2 places, the wire curled back and the posts leaning. The ground across the center of the yard was churned to mud by what had been, by all evidence, a large number of horses moving in a panic. Nora was sitting on the porch steps. She stood when he came into the yard, which he could see cost her something. The way she held her left side told him where the injury was. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and crossed the yard, and she met him halfway, and he looked at her, just looked at her for a second, taking the inventory. "The ribs," he said. 2, maybe 3. Bruised or cracked, I can't tell. It's manageable. Dobb's ankle? He's walking, slowly. Everyone else? Fine. She paused. There's a prisoner in the north barn. Young man, broke his wrist in the road. He's talking. Something shifted in Silas's expression. What's he saying? Enough. She looked at him steadily. The families they took from the Holt property and the Foss spread, they're being held in the canyon. The bowl I told you about, the one above the Meridian Fork. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ranch, at the ash and the scorch marks and the broken fence, and then back at her. You held this, he said. Barely, she said. Don't make it bigger than it was. I'm not making it anything, he said. I'm just saying what happened. She looked away first. The man who ran them, tall man, gray horse, he got out. He took most of his crew with him. She paused. He's going to come back, Silas. Not the same way, but he'll come back. I know. So we don't have much time. Garrett, who had stood back during this exchange with the tact of a man who understood when something wasn't his business, came forward now and introduced himself to Nora with a directness that she clearly hadn't expected. He shook her hand, looked at the yard, looked at her, and said, "What do you need from me?" She blinked, looked at Silas. Silas kept his face neutral. "I need every rancher in this valley who's willing to move," she said, "and I need them in the next 12 hours. "I can get 4, Garrett said, maybe 5. How many men?" "At least 20, more if you can find them." Garrett nodded once, turned to his horse, and rode back out. Silas watched him go. "You've thought about the canyon?" "All night," she said. They went inside and she laid it out for him at the kitchen table with the same rough map he'd drawn weeks ago, now marked with her additions: approach routes, the bowl geography, the water source, where the prisoners would likely be held based on what the young man in the barn had told Hector. She'd been building this while she sat on the porch steps waiting for him to come back, and the detail of it told him how long she'd actually been awake. "They'll have men on the canyon rim," she said, "north side especially. That's the natural high ground. So we can't come straight up the approach road." "No, but there's a secondary route." She put her finger on a line she'd drawn in pencil, coming around the western side of the Meridian Ridge. "It's longer. It's rough going in the dark, but it comes out above the north rim, which means we're on the high ground before they know we're there." Silas looked at the route. "You know that trail?" "I've been up it." "When Reckoner went missing?" "Yes." He sat back, looked at the map and then at her. "The prisoners. They'll be in the bowl floor, away from the horses, away from the herd, probably in the drainage on the east side where there's natural shelter." She paused. "The boy in the barn confirmed it. He was there 2 days ago." "How many guards on them?" "He thinks 4, maybe 6 at night." "And the rest of the crew?" "Scattered through the camp, cooking fire in the center, the horses on the west side of the bowl." She paused. "That's where Reckoner comes in." Silas looked at her. "The gang's horses are penned west," she said. "If Reckoner gets into that pen, the horses go. All of them. You know what he does to other horses. He's not an animal that shares space quietly. If he gets in there, they're going to have 40 horses running in every direction and half the camp chasing them." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You want to use my stallion as a distraction." "I want to use your stallion's personality as a distraction," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at the map, looked at her, looked at the map again. "He could get hurt," he said. "Yes," she said. "He could." She didn't soften it or dress it up. "I'm not going to tell you it's no risk. It is. But he knows that country. He survived it alone in a blizzard. He can handle it at night with a clear direction." Silas pressed his thumb against the edge of the table. "All right," he said. "Yeah." The ranchers came in through the evening. Not all of them. Some said no. Some couldn't be reached in time. And 2 who were reached said the right words, but Silas could see in their eyes that they wouldn't be there when the hour came, and he didn't push them. What he got was 14 men, including Garrett and Amos Trent, who had arrived at the ranch that afternoon to check on things after word reached him and had stayed without being asked. 14 men was not a cavalry. It was enough to matter and not enough to be comfortable, which seemed to be the condition the whole situation was operating under. They gathered in the north barn because it was the largest covered space, and the prisoner had been moved to the smokehouse, and Nora stood at the front of the assembled men with the map on a board she'd propped against the stall gate. The room was skeptical. Silas could feel it. The way men get when they're scared and don't want to show it. And the thing they do with that is push back on the plan. Walter Foss, whose family was among the prisoners, was there. He was a mild man under normal circumstances. Tonight he was something else. He stood at the back with his arms rigid at his sides and his jaw working, and when Nora finished laying out the approach route, he said, flatly, "You're asking us to ride a night trail on the word of a woman who used to ride with raiders." The barn went quiet. Nora didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "I am." "That's not—" "My family's in that canyon too," Garrett said from across the room. Everyone looked at him. "My nephew and his wife are in that bowl because I was too proud to work with my neighbors for 8 months, and now I'm here and I'm listening." He looked at Foss. Unless you've got a better plan, Walter. Boss's jaw worked some more. I just think the trail is real, Silas said. He was standing to the side, not at the front, but when he spoke, the room oriented to him. I know that country. The route she's describing exists, and the bowl she's describing is exactly what it is. He looked at the assembled men. I'm asking you to trust my judgment. Not hers, not yours, mine. I've run this ranch for 16 years, and I haven't led you wrong yet. A pause. Have I? Nobody said anything. Good, Silas said. We ride at midnight. The trail was brutal. Nora had said it was rough going, and she hadn't been wrong, but rough going was a thing you understood differently when you were actually on it, in the dark, with 14 horses and men who didn't know the terrain following behind you at intervals close enough to keep contact but far enough to avoid pile-ups on the narrow sections. The western side of the Meridian Ridge was loose shale and steep grade and scrub timber that reached out of the dark at face level with branches that didn't care who they hit. She led and Silas rode directly behind her and the line followed, and nobody spoke. She watched the ground in front of her with the focused attention of someone who had stored this terrain in a specific part of her memory and was now reading it back in conditions that were nothing like the one she'd stored it in. Twice she stopped and sat still on her horse and looked at the dark around her, recalibrating, and both times she found what she was looking for and moved on. The second time, Silas pulled up beside her in a wider section of trail. You good? He said quietly. Yes. She paused. 40 yards ahead at switchbacks. Tell them to go slow. He passed it back. They reached the rim an hour before first light. The trail crested and flattened into a rocky shelf, and suddenly the bowl was below them. A broad, dark depression in the mountain, maybe 200 yards across, lit by the orange pulse of a central fire. She could see the horse pen on the western edge, dark shapes moving against each other. She could see the camp laid out around the fire. She could see, at the far eastern drainage, a shelter of tarps and what looked like a wagon. Silas came up beside her and looked down. The shelter, she said quietly. East side. I see it. Foss and Garrett take their men down the eastern approach. Keep it slow until they're in the drainage, then fast. She looked at him. You take the rest to the north rim above the camp. When the horses go, you come down. And you? He said. She had Reckoner's lead rope in her hand. She'd brought him up the trail on a long lead, and the stallion had come with characteristic opinion. He'd objected to the shale twice and to a particular tree branch once, and otherwise had moved through the dark with the kind of reluctant competence that was his defining quality. Silas looked at the rope in her hand, then at her. You're taking him in yourself, he said. It wasn't a question. If I release him from up here, he might turn back. He needs to be close enough to smell the other horses. She paused. And close enough that I can get to the pen gate. Your ribs will hurt whether I'm sitting up here or going down there, she said. I'd rather they hurt for a reason. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and she could see something moving through his expression that wasn't argument and wasn't agreement, something more complicated than either. Stay low, he said finally. Get to the pen and get out. Don't wait to see what Reckoner does. I know what he'll do, she said. I know you do. I'm telling you anyway. She almost smiled. All right. She took the stallion down the western slope on foot, leading him at a walk, moving through the scrub timber with her hand on his neck, and her breathing kept low and deliberate. He was alert. She could feel it through the rope, the fine tension of an animal that smelled something and was working out what to make of it. His ears were forward, and his steps were precise in the way they got when he was paying full attention. Easy, she said, barely a sound. Easy. The camp's western edge was a rope pen strung between 4 timber posts, and it held maybe 30 horses in a space that was workable but not spacious, close enough quarters that the animals were already doing the subtle negotiating that horses do when there isn't quite enough room. She counted the guards she could see, 2 at the fire, 1 making a circuit on the north side, 1 she couldn't locate. She got to the pen gate with Reckoner pressed close behind her, his breath warm on the back of her neck, and she stood at the gate for 3 seconds listening for the missing guard. She heard him before she saw him, a scrape of boot on rock, south of the pen, moving away. She waited. counted to 10. Then she opened the gate. Reckoner went through it like he'd been waiting for permission his whole life. He went through it, and he hit the middle of that pen, and he made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a roar, but was somewhere between them. A sound that said, in the unmistakable language of horses, that this space now had a different authority in it, and all prior arrangements were canceled. 30 horses decided all at once that wherever they were, they needed to be somewhere else. The pen gate she'd opened wasn't the only point of failure. The rope stringing was designed to hold horses that accepted their containment, and these horses had abruptly stopped accepting it. The south section went first. A big bay hit it at a run, and the post pulled and the rope snapped and the bay was gone, and 20 horses followed it, because that was the direction with the least obstacle. The remaining 10 went north and west through the scrub and the dark, crashing through timber, and the camp went from firelit quiet to total chaos in about 8 seconds. She'd already moved. She was back in the timber before the pen collapsed, moving uphill with her hand pressed to her side and her breath coming short and hot from the ribs. And above her on the north rim she heard Silas bring the men down. What happened next was loud and ugly and nothing like a plan. Plans don't survive the moment they make contact with the reality they were made for. Every version of events she'd ever been part of had taught her this, and tonight confirmed it again. Foss and Garrett came into the eastern drainage and hit the guards there, and it went fast and rough. And one of Garrett's men took a rifle shot in the shoulder that would heal, but that made the next 10 minutes considerably more complicated. Silas's group came down the north rim and into the camp and the camp's defenders, who had been trying to manage 30 missing horses and a fire that was getting kicked around in the chaos, were trying to fight a rear-guard action against men coming from above while also not getting trampled. The leader on the gray horse, she'd lost him in the first minute, and that scared her more than anything else. She found him on the south side of the bowl, on foot, which meant the gray horse had been among the ones that ran. He was moving toward the drainage, toward the prisoners, and she understood immediately what he was doing. He was going for leverage. He was going for the thing he still had. She cut him off. She came around the south side of a boulder, and they were 10 feet apart. And he stopped. And she stopped. And they looked at each other. He was older than she'd thought from a distance, mid-50s, with a face that had been hard for a long time, and eyes that were doing the same calculation hers were. "You ran my men off a ranch with a ditch fire and some scared cattle," he said. His voice was even, almost conversational. "I did," she said. "That was you?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "Decker's crew," he said. "I heard he had a woman who knew terrain work." Decker's crew was a long time ago. Not that long. He tilted his head slightly. "You could walk away from this, right now. Whatever arrangement you've got with the rancher, it's not worth—" "The family's in that drainage," she said. "You're going to step away from them and put your hands where I can see them." He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Or the 14 men coming down that ridge in the next 30 seconds are going to have a much less complicated conversation with you than I'm having right now. He heard them before she finished, the sound of boots on rock, men moving fast on the north side. He turned his head toward the sound, and that half second was what it cost him. She closed the distance, and she was not gentle about it, and his ribs hurt more than hers did by the time Silas and Garrett came around the boulder and found them. Silas looked at her, looked at the man on the ground, looked back at her. "You said stay low," she said. "I did," he said. "I tried." They brought the prisoners out of the drainage as the sky was going from black to gray in the east, that thin, uncertain light that isn't quite dawn yet, but is the promise of it. 7 people, 2 families from the Holt and Foss properties, including a woman with a young child who had been held for 4 days. They came out blinking and shaky-legged, and Foss went to his wife and held her in a way that made several of the ranchers around them look at the ground. Silas stood at the edge of the drainage and watched and said nothing. Nora stood beside him, slightly apart, her hand pressed to her ribs. The pain had settled into a steady, insistent rhythm that she was managing by not thinking about it directly. "It's not over," she said quietly. "No," he said. "There are men who got out last night who are still out there. The territorial marshal needs to know, all of it, The canyon, the herd they've been accumulating, the numbers. She paused. The prisoner from the barn will talk. The man I... She stopped. He'll talk too, Silas said. With enough incentive. She nodded. Around them, the bowl was going quiet in the growing gray light. Men were checking each other for damage, tending to Garrett's injured hand, gathering what horses had been retrieved. Reckoner was standing at the south end of the bowl with the expression of an animal who had done something he found satisfying and was waiting for acknowledgement. Hector, who had somehow ended up with the stallion's lead rope, was keeping a respectful distance. Amos Trent walked up to Silas and shook his hand without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "That trail was the worst thing I have ever ridden in my life." "I know," Silas said. "I would do it again," Amos said, and went back to his horse. Garrett came and stood on Silas's other side. He was tired in the bone-deep way of a man who has been running on fear and purpose and has just run out of both. "My nephew's all right," he said. "Good," Silas said. "I should have listened to you 2 months ago." "Yes," Silas said. "But you're here now?" Garrett made a sound that was something between a laugh and something else. He clapped Silas on the shoulder once and walked away. The valley below was still in shadow. From the canyon rim you could see it stretching south and east, the ranches still small and separate in the early light, the distances between them long. It had been those distances more than anything that the raiders had relied on. The distances and the pride and the habit of managing alone. Silas looked at it, and then he looked at Nora, who was looking at the same thing with an expression he was beginning to know. Not quite at peace, not quite not. The face of someone who had done what needed doing and was now, in the quiet after, doing the accounting. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." She turned at the word and something in her face shifted at it, just slightly, just enough that he saw it, and he meant for her to. They rode down out of the mountains as the sun finally cleared the eastern ridgeline and the valley came up gold and long below them. And for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, they were not riding alone. The ride back down from the mountains took 2 hours, and nobody talked much. That was fine. There are kinds of exhaustion that talking makes worse, and this was that kind. The kind that sits in your chest and your hands and behind your eyes all at once. The kind that comes after something is over, and your body is only now beginning to believe it. The rescued families rode double with the ranchers, and the horses moved slow on the descent, and the valley came up to meet them gradually in the morning light. Nora rode with her hand pressed to her left side and her eyes on the trail ahead. The ribs had gone from sharp to dull, which was either improvement or her body running out of the energy to protest. She couldn't tell which. She was aware of Silas riding a few lengths ahead, occasionally turning to check the line behind him, occasionally glancing back at her in a way that he probably thought was less obvious than it was. When they reached the valley floor and the trail widened enough to ride abreast, he pulled back until he was beside her. "Doctor's in Ridgeholm," he said. "I know where the doctor is. You need to go today. I need to get back to the ranch first." He looked at her. "Nora. The fence is open in 2 places and the cattle are somewhere on the eastern plain," she said. "And somebody needs to deal with the prisoner in the smokehouse before he causes a problem. Hector can manage the prisoner. I'll send Cole for the cattle. The fence? I will fix the fence," he said, in a tone that meant the conversation was over. "You're going to the doctor." She didn't argue further, which was itself a measure of how the ribs were actually feeling. The town was not prepared for what rode into it that morning. 14 ranchers, 2 freed families, a prisoner tied to a horse, and the man who led the outfit that had been terrorizing the valley for over a year. All of it coming down the main road of Ridgeholm at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, covered in trail dust and dried mud and the particular worn-down look of people who had spent the night doing something difficult. People came out of the mercantile and the feed store and the hotel and stood on the boardwalk and watched. Silas went directly to the marshal's office. Marshal Cade was a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s who had been marshal of Ridgeholm for 11 years, and who had the quality of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him. He came out when he heard the horses and stood in his doorway and looked at the assembled group for a long moment before he looked at Silas. "Tell me," he said. Silas told him. "All of it." The months of cattle theft, the valley-wide pattern, the raid on the Boone Ranch, the canyon, the families, the prisoner. He kept it factual and sequenced, and he gave Cade what he needed without editorializing. Cade listened with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between Silas and the prisoner, and occasionally to Nora, who had dismounted and was standing slightly apart from the group with Hector nearby. When Silas finished, Cade looked at the prisoner for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need statements from everyone." "You'll have them," Silas said. "Today." "Today," Silas agreed. He paused. "But the woman needs a doctor first." Cade looked at Nora. She met his gaze. "After the doctor," Cade said. The doctor's name was Whitmore, and he was a thin, precise man who didn't waste words or sympathy. He examined Nora's ribs with hands that were thorough if not particularly gentle, told her two were cracked and the third was bruised, wrapped her torso in a way that felt like being put in a vice, and told her to avoid any lifting, riding hard, or, and here he looked at her over his spectacles, whatever it was she'd been doing that caused this. "Avoiding raids," she said. "Yes," he said, as if this was a reasonable response. "Avoid those." Silas waited outside. When she came out, he was sitting on the bench in front of the office with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He looked up when she came through the door. "Well?" he said. "2 cracked ribs, 1 bruised." She sat down beside him carefully. "He wrapped them." "Good." "He told me to avoid raids." "Reasonable advice," Silas said. They sat there for a moment. The main street of Ridgeholm moved around them, people going about their Thursday, some of them glancing over with barely concealed curiosity about the group that had come in that morning, about the prisoner now locked in the marshal's office, about the Holt and Foss families reunited on the hotel porch across the street. "I need to give my statement," Nora said. "I know." He didn't move. "In a minute." She looked at him. He was still turning the hat. "Silas, I keep thinking about you on that canyon slope," he said, "with Reckoner, in the dark. It worked. It could have not worked." "Most things could not work," she said. "You still have to do them." He looked at her then, directly, and she looked back. "When I rode back and saw the ranch," he said, "the fire damage, the fence, I had about 30 seconds where I didn't know if you were—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want 30 seconds like that again." She was quiet. "That's not something you can guarantee," she said carefully. "Not in this life, not on this land." "No," he said, "it's not." He turned the hat one more time and then he stopped turning it. "But I'd like to try to earn the right to worry about it, specifically about you. Specifically." The street went on around them. Someone's wagon went past, and the horse looked at them with the enormous indifference that horses have for human conversations. She looked down at her hands. The cut on her left hand had healed into a thin pink line, barely visible. He'd cleaned it that first night on the kitchen table in the hours after the blizzard. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I know that. I don't come from the kind of life that makes things easy." She paused. "I don't know how to be what those women are. Margaret Holt and Dolores Pruitt and all of them. I don't know how to be that." "I'm not asking you to be any of them," he said. "I spent 3 years not choosing any of them. I think I knew why, even when I couldn't say it." She was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere across the street, the Foss children were making noise on the hotel porch. The particular noise of children who have been scared and are now safe and can't quite contain the relief of it. "I'd need to know the ranch is mine to work," she said finally. "Not as a hand, as someone who has say in how it runs." "Yes. And I'd need—" She stopped. "I'd need time to figure out what I'm doing. I'm not good at the other parts, the people parts." "You're better than you think," he said. "That's not a high bar," she said. He almost smiled. "No, it's not." He looked at her. "But I've watched you for 6 months. I've watched you work, and I've watched you under pressure, and I've watched you when you didn't know anyone was looking." He paused. "I'm not asking for the person you think I want. I'm asking for the one who's already here." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at terrain, carefully, with real attention, reading what was actually there instead of what she expected. "Okay," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Okay," he said. They sat there a minute longer, neither of them making it into anything more than it was, and then she said she needed to go give her statement, and they got up and crossed the street to the marshal's office, and that was that. The statements took most of the day. Marshal Cade was systematic about it. He took each person through their account separately, wrote it down, asked his questions, moved to the next. By the time he'd gotten through Silas and Nora and Garrett and Foss and the Hands and the freed families, it was late afternoon and the light was going long and orange across the street outside his window. The prisoner gave his statement last. Silas wasn't in the room for it, but Cade told him afterward, in the way of a man who believes in sharing information with the people it concerns, that the man had been cooperative, unusually so. "Why?" Silas said. Cade looked at him. He said the woman made it clear to him on that canyon slope that his alternatives were limited. He said, Cade paused, and for a moment something that might have been humor crossed his face briefly. He said she was more frightening than anyone he'd met in 20 years of this business, and he'd prefer to be on the side of the law going forward. Silas thought about this. "She has that effect," he said. Cade sent a rider to the territorial marshal's office that evening with a full written account and a request for a deputy to come collect the prisoner and coordinate the recovery of the stolen cattle still presumably held in the canyon bowl. He told Silas it would take a week, maybe 2. "I'll need everyone who is up there to be available for follow-up questions," Cade said. "They will be," Silas said. He rode back to the ranch in the early evening with Nora beside him and Hector and Cole ahead, and the sky was going pink and copper above the western ridge, and the valley was quiet in the particular way it gets at the end of a long day when the wind has died. The work of putting things back together was not dramatic. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. When the story got told and retold in Ridgeholm and in the surrounding ranches, and eventually in places further away than that, the part that got left out was the weeks of plain, grinding labor that followed. The north fence took 4 days to rebuild properly. The cattle rounded up from the eastern plain came back in groups over the better part of a week, and 3 were never recovered. The hay lean-to had to be rebuilt from the ground up, which meant new timber and 3 days of framing and 2 more of roofing. The scorch mark on the south barn wall came off with wire brushing and time. Nora worked it all with her ribs wrapped and Whitmore's instructions mostly observed, which meant she didn't lift anything heavier than 30 pounds and didn't ride hard and otherwise did what needed doing. Silas watched her push the line of what the doctor had permitted and didn't say anything about it because he'd seen enough of her to know that saying something wouldn't help, and she wasn't being reckless. She was calibrating, measuring what her body could do against what needed doing, the way people who've learned to work through pain actually operate. The valley came back to life around them. Garrett coordinated with the other ranchers to do a proper collective count of the stolen cattle, which took the better part of 2 weeks and involved more cooperation between neighboring spreads than had happened in the previous decade. It was uncomfortable and occasionally contentious. Old boundary disputes resurfaced, old grievances got aired, but it happened, and the count got done. And when the territorial deputy arrived to take custody of the prisoner and organize the recovery from the canyon bowl, there was a unified accounting to give him. The deputy was a young man named Aldous, who had clearly been expecting something smaller than what he got. He sat in Silas's kitchen the first evening and looked at the documents Nora had helped compile. Dates, locations, estimated cattle numbers, witness accounts, and said, after a long pause, "You folks put this together yourselves?" "Mostly her," Silas said. Aldous looked at Nora. She looked back. "This is good work," he said. "It needed doing," she said. He stayed 4 days. By the time he left, there was enough documentation to prosecute the leader and the identified members of his crew on charges that would keep them occupied for a considerable time. The territorial marshal's office sent a letter 2 weeks later confirming the cattle recovery and the charges filed. Silas read it at the kitchen table and passed it across to Nora without comment. She read it, put it down, went back to the inventory she'd been working on. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. The town came around in the way towns do, slowly and without admitting it was happening. It started with Walter Foss, who was not a complicated man and who processed what had happened in the canyon in the most direct way available to him, which was to go to the Boone Ranch on a Tuesday morning and thank Nora in person. He stood in the yard with his hat in both hands and said that his wife and his children were home because of what she'd done, and that he owed her more than he knew how to say, and that he was sorry for what he'd said in the barn before the canyon raid. Nora looked at him for a moment. "You were scared," she said. "I was," he said. "I still said it." "Yes," she said. "You did." She let that sit for a second. "Thank you for coming." He nodded and got back in his wagon and drove off, and Hector, who had watched this from the barn doorway, came out and stood beside her. "That's the first one," he said. "The first what?" "The first of a lot," he said. He wasn't wrong. Garrett came the following week and brought 2 of the other ranchers with him. Amos Trent had never really stopped coming by. He was a man of reliable habits, and one of those habits was apparently being present at the Boone Ranch, regardless of the social weather. Even Margaret Holt came, eventually, which was the one that surprised Nora most. She came alone, on a Wednesday afternoon, in a good dress, and she sat in Silas's parlor and drank the coffee that Nora made, and for a while neither of them said what they were there to say. Then Margaret put her cup down and looked at Nora directly. "I made your life harder than it needed to be," she said. Nora looked at her. She was a woman in her 50s with a face that had been pretty once and was still good, with the particular dignity of someone who knows when she's been wrong and hates it, but does it anyway. "You didn't know me," Nora said. "I didn't try to." "No," Nora agreed, "but you know me a little now." Margaret was quiet. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" A pause. "Something harder. Something that didn't care." She picked up her cup again. "You care about things. I can see it. You just carry it differently than most people." Nora didn't answer that. She turned her own cup in her hands and looked at the window and thought about what caring differently looked like from the outside. How it probably looked like not caring at all most of the time to people who expressed it the other way. "I appreciate you coming," she said finally. Margaret nodded. She finished her coffee and she left, and the afternoon settled back into itself, and Nora sat in the parlor alone for a while before she went back outside. Silas found her at the fence line an hour later, the way he often did. She went to the fence when she needed to think, some habit she'd built out of all those months of checking it. He came up beside her, and they stood looking at the north pasture, where the cattle had drifted back to their usual patterns, moving slow and unhurried through the late afternoon grass. "Margaret came," he said. "I know, you probably sent her." "I did not," he said. "That was all her." She looked at him. He looked back with the honest, uncomplicated expression that was the thing she trusted most about him, the thing she'd trusted from the beginning, even when she didn't want to trust anything. "The valley's not going to be the same after this," she said. "No. People don't go back to working alone once they've seen what working together does." She paused. "Even if they want to, even if it's uncomfortable." "You'd know about that," he said. She looked at the pasture. "I've spent 3 years trying to be separate, from what I was and the people I was with and all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "The canyon. It reminded me that the skills I built in a bad life are just skills. They don't belong to the life that made them." "No," he said. "They don't." "I'm still figuring that out," she said. "That's fine," he said. You've got time." She looked at him, and something in the plainness of that, "you've got time," hit her in a place that wasn't the ribs. It was such a simple thing to say. It was the thing nobody had said to her in 3 years of moving and working and keeping her past at the edge of view, waiting for it to catch up. "You've got time." As if this were a place she could stay. As if staying were something that was allowed. She looked away before her face did anything she'd have to explain. "The irrigation channel needs extending," she said, "if we're going to handle a larger herd next spring." "I know," he said, "and the east barn needs a new section of roof before winter. 2 boards are cracked." "I know that too." "And you need—" She stopped, looked at him. "You're not writing any of this down." "I don't need to write it down," he said. "You're going to be here." The evening light was going gold across the pasture, the way it did this time of year in the valley, when the sun hit the mountains at exactly the right angle and everything caught it and threw it back. The cattle moved through it, unhurried. Reckoner stood at the far end of the pasture near the rebuilt fence, exactly where he liked to stand at this hour, asserting ownership over the view. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to be here." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Matin. The formal part, the asking, happened in front of people, which was not something either of them had planned. It was at Garrett's place, a gathering of the Valley ranchers that had become, over the course of the summer, something that happened regularly and without the friction that had characterized every prior attempt at cooperation. People brought food and they talked through the problems of the season, and sometimes they argued and sometimes they didn't, and it was not harmonious or particularly graceful, but it was real, and real was better than graceful. Silas and Nora had ridden over together, which was not remarkable since they rode most places together now, and the evening had gone the way those evenings went. Food, talk, the Foss children running themselves ragged in the yard, when Silas stood up. Nobody expected it. He was not a man who stood up at gatherings to say things. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that isn't on the schedule. He looked at Nora across the room. "I want to say something," he said, which was not the most eloquent beginning, and he seemed to know it because something crossed his face that might have been the frontier equivalent of a man collecting himself. She looked back at him with an expression that was doing several things at once and not letting any of them win entirely. "I spent a long time turning down things that looked like what I needed," he said, "and I've thought about why. And the honest answer is that I wasn't waiting for something better. I was waiting for something real." He paused. "I found it." The room was very quiet. "I'd like you to build this with me," he said. "Not as a hand, not as someone who's here on borrowed terms. As my partner." Another pause. "As my wife, if you'll have me. With the understanding that you'll tell me when I'm wrong and keep an eye on the north fence line and probably scare the marshal's deputy again the next time he comes through." Something moved through the room that wasn't quite laughter, but was close to it. Nora looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that the room held its breath again. "You know I'm going to have opinions about how the East pasture gets managed," she said. "I assumed," he said, "and I'm going to be right about most of them." "You have been so far." She stood up, crossed the room to him, through the quiet and the gathered people and the particular weight of a moment that everyone present understood they were going to remember. She stopped in front of him, and she was not a woman who performed things, so what her face was doing was simply what she felt, which was complicated and real and not remotely clean. "All right," she said, and this time it meant everything it had never quite meant before. They were married in October, when the first frost had come and the valley had gone amber and rust, and the ceremony was small because neither of them wanted a large one. And the only notable event was Reckoner getting loose from the fence where he'd been tied and inserting himself briefly into the proceedings in a way that was deeply inconvenient and entirely characteristic. The valley changed, that year and the one after. Not all at once, and not without resistance, and not into anything that could be fairly described as perfect. The ranchers argued. Old disputes didn't disappear. There were still men who preferred to work alone, and some of them had reasons, and some of them had habits, and the difference wasn't always easy to tell. But the pattern that the raiders had relied on, the isolation, the separate counts, the months where nobody compared notes, that pattern was broken, and broken things of that kind don't always mend back to their original shape. Silas filed the cooperative range agreement with the county office that fall, after 3 months of negotiating language that 7 stubborn men could all find a way to accept. Nora sat in on every meeting and said less than anyone else, and caught more than anyone else. And when the language finally went into the document, it had the structural precision of someone who had thought about how agreements fail and worked backward from there. She wasn't perfect at any of it. She was too direct with people who needed more handling than she had patience for. And there were town women who never fully came around. And there were mornings when the weight of what she'd been and what she'd done sat on her in ways she didn't have clean language for. She didn't pretend it wasn't there. She just worked the way she'd always worked and let the work be the argument that her words weren't. Silas watched her build herself into the valley the way she built everything, without asking for credit, without performing the effort, just doing it until it was done. He watched her the way he'd watched her from the beginning, from that first night when she'd sat at his kitchen table and turned a coffee cup in her hands, and wouldn't take a reward and wouldn't explain herself, and was so clearly running from something that she'd outpaced what she was running from and ended up somewhere she hadn't planned. The thing Silas had understood by the end of all of it was something that took him a long time to put into plain words. It had to do with the difference between the life you choose and the life you make. He'd spent 7 years after Clara choosing the ranch, choosing the work, choosing the cattle and the fence lines and the cold and the season. He'd been good at choosing. He'd been less good at making. Nora came from a life she hadn't chosen, mostly, and had spent 3 years trying to make something different out of what she had. She was better at making than choosing. They were, between them, a more complete instrument than either had been alone. That wasn't romance. That was something more durable than romance. The kind of thing that holds up when the fence is broken and the cattle are scattered and the ribs are cracked and there's still work to do before dark. The valley learned to hold together, imperfectly and occasionally unwillingly, because the alternative had been demonstrated. The Boone Ranch grew, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, the way things grow when two people are both paying attention to them. The East Barn got its new roof before the first snow. The irrigation channel got its extension the following spring. Reckoner remained opinionated about everything and beloved by no one except Nora, who understood him, and Silas, who respected the consistency. And in the evening, sometimes, when the work was done and the light was going low and gold across the north pasture, they sat on the porch steps, the same porch steps where she'd been sitting the night she first told him to be careful, the night he'd first understood that something was coming and that he wasn't facing it alone. And they sat with whatever the day had left them with, and they didn't always talk. The quiet between them had never needed filling. It still didn't. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. More than enough. It was the real thing, plain and undecorated, and it would hold.